Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from geopolitics to the OECD's latest developments. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. PwC's Pillar 2 engine, powered by Beacon, is a game changer for Pillar 2 modeling, provision, and compliance calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this cloud-based centralized rules engine is developed by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and is also available to license. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're back in Washington, D.C. in PwC's Policy on Demand studio, where I'm excited to have Craig Stronberg back on the podcast. Craig is the Senior Director of PwC Intelligence, spearheading a team of analysts helping global businesses with geopolitical risk, macroeconomic volatility, and supply chain shifts. Craig had a nearly 20-year career in national security affairs. During that time, he worked for and advised numerous agencies and international partners, having been decorated 5 times. Craig, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
I'm delighted to be back.
All right, well, before we dive into geopolitics, and there's a lot to talk about, Craig, I know a lot of my listeners begrudgingly are interested in baseball, since I like to break the ice and talk about baseball. We're recording this today, July 31st. It is the trade deadline. And so what that means for most of my listeners who have no interest in baseball is that in baseball, over a 162-game season, there is a deadline where any trades can happen because they want teams to tank at the end of the year and have all these. So this is the day when baseball fans find out, is your team vying for a playoff spot? Are they buyers and looking to improve the team, or have they given up on the season and are looking to sell their assets and trade their players? And what I've learned, Craig, over the last 48 hours is that my Cardinals are sellers, unfortunately. It's been a long time since we've had some success in St. Louis, but it's a disappointing day for me as a Cardinal fan. I'm still going to root for them till the end of the year, but who's your team and how are they doing?
So unfortunately, my team is the Chicago White Sox.
Wow.
So there are a lot of similarities, right, between them and the Cardinals, right? There's a very traditional blue-collar workforce that is like the backbone of the fan base.
Absolutely.
That consistently goes to the games. And unfortunately, they are sellers this year, too.
Yeah. Chicago. But on a good side, on a good note, I mean, the Pope is a White Sox fan.
The Pope is a White Sox fan, right? So that was a bump. Obama is still a White Sox fan.
Yeah.
But, unless the Pope develops a really good slider, then he isn't going to help us as much as we would probably need. And for all I know, he has one. I don't want to presume.
Right.
But
there was a lot of controversy. You remember whether he was a Cub, because he was from Chicago, whether he was a Cubs fan or White Sox fan. As a Cardinals fan, I was very excited to learn that he was
I'm sure,
a White Sox fan.
Yeah.
All right. So let's dive into geopolitics. And again, no shortage of things to discuss. Maybe we'll start with what do you see as the most consequential geopolitical shifts unfolding right now? And I think you got a lot to choose from.
There is a tremendous amount to choose from. So, I think the biggie off the top of the bat, since the last time we talked a little while ago, is the U.S. has changed its dynamic globally in a more obvious way. I think one of the things that is not always obvious to businesses is that if you look at the last 3 administrations, so Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2, there's actually a significant amount of comparability and agreement about protectionism. Right? These were very pro-protectionist presidents. They just talked about it differently. So Biden got away with, I think, a lot more that Trump doesn't always, because he sort of didn't promote everything that he was doing. But all of that means that the U.S. is acting in a much more unpredictable way, in a way that makes it much harder for countries to understand the United States and understand U.S. policy. And it's throwing their assumptions, their planning, their alliances, their investments, their supply chains, all of that sort of up in the air. Because you've been able to sort of depend on the U.S. to have sort of the same approach to the world, decade over decade over decade, no matter who is in power, Republican or Democrat. The last couple of years, that's kind of changed. And that is a big shift in the operating environment. I would say one of the other big ones is there has been a real growth of power among the other powers of the world. So There was a long time when, for instance, the BRICS, which was originally comprised of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now has 10 other members, including in Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf and Africa, they were not looked at as a serious contender in terms of being an alternative to the G7 or the G20. I think that has changed. They are still not ready to have something like a single currency of their own, but they are truly coming together, presenting an alternative model of governance to what the West has always offered. And they are also increasingly speaking for the other power that is on the rise, and that is collectively the global South, right? Which is the variety of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, et cetera, that often have been kept out of the haves, if you will. And they are increasingly really angry, this group. I think when I think back to the Ukraine invasion, I think what many people listening and watching would think about would be the chaos of the conflict. What I think about was, in terms of geopolitical impact, when the US and Europe asked for people to get on board with isolating Russia, most of the world said no, because for many years, right, Europe and the United States had not gone to the global South and resolved their crises. And so this time the global South did not get on board. So I think those two things are the big ones that I'm looking at. The last one that I would say is AI. And I think geopolitics has the capability to be the spoiler for AI, because if AI becomes about a race between Europe versus the United States versus China, if it becomes about geopolitics and not about business and science and technology, then I think what you're going to have is a lot security that should be built into the system that might be thrown away for the sake of expediency.
For the race.
Yes.
To the top of AI. On your second point, I just wanted to highlight, we're seeing that from a global tax policy perspective. As far as the shift, you talked about the BRICS and the global South, but an example that comes to mind is with respect to Pillar 2 and the OECD. I think there are a number of what we tend to refer to in the tax realm as the developing countries, many of which are in the global South, and some that you had mentioned, do not feel that they are necessarily adequately represented by the OECD. We've seen now this new tax sort of initiative occurring within the UN. So I'm interested to see how that is going to play out from a tax perspective, because for decades, and certainly at least my entire career, it was the OECD that really set global tax policy and sort of administered or worked with administrators of global tax policy. And I think that a number of the developing countries don't necessarily feel like they've been represented, and Pillar 2 is something that they've been highlighting for that. And it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic shifts from a global tax policy perspective between the OECD and the UN.
So I think that's probably the perfect example. And I think the point there is, at some point relatively soon, if those instruments like the OECD can't include and advantage the global South and BRICS will create new ones that can.
Yeah, a very dynamic time. So we know that the global power dynamics are changing. And really, how are they, and what does that mean for the rules of global commerce?
So I think one of the things that's happening with the rules of global commerce is that one of the debates that geopolitics is bringing about is globalization good or is globalization bad? And I think in the US, I think on both sides of the aisle, there are quite a few number of people who would say that globalization has not been as good as was originally advertised. When you think about this from a global point of view, though, there are still a lot of places in the world that see globalization and trade as a negative good, right? Free trade is not always as popular here in DC as it once was, but you get out on the Pacific Rim, you get out in places in Europe, you get out into the Persian Gulf, freer trade and globalization is still seen as a positive. And so I think there was increasingly a disruption between how people view those different things. And if that means that the US and the rest of the world are going to go in different directions, that means that those parts of the world that can ally themselves with one another, either through treaty or real foreign trade agreements or other aspects of agreement or concord, they may have the advantage and they may increasingly get the lion's share of foreign direct investment if you look out 10, 20, 30 years. And it just so happens that a lot of those places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, have demographic dividends that we don't and Europe doesn't. And so not only might they be advantaged in many ways macroeconomically, but they may have a lot of people they can bring to bear to help solve the problems.
Yeah, and maybe you can talk a little about and I appreciate you're not an expert in tariffs, but the tariff policy insofar as how that is impacting particularly sort of arguably protectionism in the US, and what are your kind of views on that and how that's playing out? And again, we're recording this in July. I mean, this is just a whipsaw
Yes.
where deals are now loosely knit deals. We're still waiting, I think, on a lot of details, but we certainly know that the tariff rates are going up in the US. I thought with the UK it was kind of going to be 10, and then with Europe it's 15, and now we're hearing some other countries that are talking about 20%, I think, including India. Any views on that and how that impacts sort of commerce and geopolitics?
Yeah, it's perfect, because it fits right in the middle of all of it. So, look, whenever this airs, I think this is still going to be an issue. I think it's going to be an issue for a while. And I would say that is a key takeaway for those who are watching, is don't make the false assumption that even if there's a lot of progress that's made in the next couple of weeks, that means that the tariff issue is one you aren't going to have to continue to grapple with. Because to me, the key word in what you just said was details, right? Trade agreements, real solid agreements like USMCA, right, are fully backed by law. They are passed by parliaments and congresses. They are there for you to go read if you want to read them. There's guidance and lawyers and accountants that went through them. What we are seeing is something else. We are seeing promissory notes, handshakes. We're seeing very abbreviated agreements between massive economies to cooperate better. That has its advantages. One of the advantages being speed. It has some disadvantages too. And one of the disadvantages is if all that you've agreed to is on the back of a napkin, you or the other party can walk away from that napkin at any point and say, I don't think this is being enforced properly. I'm going to stop doing this. And I think you will see over the next year, the year or two, whether it be the US or the parties that it is coming to a concord about this with, you're going to see them have differences of opinion, and we're going to have to do this dance all over again.
This is the devil's in the details, right? And this is a point, I live in the tax world, so I keep bringing it back to tax. The G7 agreement that we recently saw, encouraging the U.S., the Senate and the Congress to pull out this Section 899, this potential retaliatory provision. But similarly, that's a high-level agreement, right? The devil's in the details. We actually need to see the administrative guidance, and ultimately, even the administrative guidance that we're going to receive, it's not law. To your point, the law matters, and it's going to take time for these trade deals, this G7 agreement to actually get passed into law. And so I think that a lot of taxpayers, businesses will look at these and celebrate these as wins. And what I just try to caution people is like, hey, the devil's in the details. We need to see the agreements, and things can change between when that initial agreement is struck. And listen, in any deal, it starts with sort of concepts and bullet points, right? So this isn't being critical of any of the negotiators, but the devil is in the details. It just takes time for those details to work their way through the system and actually become law.
Agreed.
All right. So one of the things that we hear a lot about, and we talked on our prior podcast, is de-risking. So what does it actually look like for multinational companies in practice? I mean, we see this a lot in there's just so much uncertainty. How do we de-risk in this type of environment?
Very carefully. So it's very difficult to get our hands completely around all the different approaches out there, all the different multinational company strategies, sector to sector. In general, between myself and my colleagues here in the firm, this is kind of how we see the approach being taken, for what it's worth. And I think it's directionally correct. I would say that from a de-risking point of view, globally, not just in the US, most multinational companies, most companies, I would say 80% at a minimum are in a wait and see moment, right? They don't know enough about everything that we've talked about thus far in the podcast, right? They don't have the answers to this, neither do we, right? And until they do, they're not going to change a thing,
Right.
which is a perfectly reasonable approach. There's another 15% where there's an active conversation happening at the board or C-suite level about should they be changing something? Should they be changing supply chain or strategy or operations or personnel or sourcing or financing or something? Should they be doing a big multinational deal? They haven't decided anything, but there's really interesting dynamic discussion going on here. And quite frankly, a lot of the boards that I'm talking to, they're in that 15%, and they're interesting discussions to be a part of. The smallest group by far is the remaining 5%. And those are the companies who have decided, yes, even in this environment, I'm going to pull the trigger and I'm going to do something, which is a risk of its own.
Sure.
But they've decided that it's enough. I think that if the environment that we're in continues, which I think that it will, and this is one of the biggest takeaways that I would like listeners and viewers to have, is that if businesses are looking at all of the volatility that we're talking about and assuming that it's temporary, I think they're wrong. I think this volatility is being built into the global geopolitical system. I think the tectonic plates are shifting, and we don't know where they're going to be and what quakes are going to result. But there's a lot of big structural movement happening here, and all of that means that we're going to have a lot of disruption for time to come. So I think that 80% group that is sort of sitting and waiting isn't going to get any smaller. It may even get bigger. Look, I have a great deal of empathy for anybody trying to manage a company through all of this, especially if you just manage your company through COVID.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with being in that 80%. What I would say is if you are, understand what it takes to get to the 15%. Doesn't mean you have to shift up there, but understand it so that if the time comes when you do want to start to explore more, you're ready.
Yeah, what on the COVID point, what I've seen with the number of multinationals is that I think a number of companies, particularly from a supply chain perspective, because obviously that was just some major issues for multinationals in supply chain, they learned how to become more nimble on the supply chain, identifying alternative source of origin, for example. But the bigger question is, do companies go out and make very big structural changes? In other words, build a manufacturing plant in the US or build a manufacturing plant somewhere else or acquire somebody who does that. And I think it's been relatively quiet. I like the percentages, right, of who's kind of on the sidelines and who's in the game. And I think what I hear as I talk to folks is obviously they're looking for more certainty. But the problem is, as they get more certainty, right, then prices are going to go up, and the others will also have more certainty. So it's a challenge.
Agreed.
All right. So what regions or countries should global companies be watching more closely, but maybe aren't?
So the most interesting geopolitical convergence of the last several months, to me, occurred the week after President Trump was in the Persian Gulf. The week after, many of those same countries, who are amongst the most dynamic economies in the world, they traveled east and they had a three-way meeting between the Gulf countries, the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, and China. And what they basically agreed to was, if they look out at the next 20, 25 years, those three could be and probably will be amongst the most dynamic economies at play. And they're going to figure out how to do this together. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Where you're seeing sort of Southeast, East, and Southwest Asia coming together to figure out, over time, how do they act in more concert? Not as an alliance, not as something formal yet, but that is interesting because to me, when I look at areas of growth, Southeast Asia and the Arabian Peninsula countries, right, are in many ways most interesting. There's interesting things happening there in terms of AI. There's massive amounts of capital dollars and capital investment going on. There's really interesting demographic dividends and youthful populations. And if you look at the risk scores of many of these countries, they're really good. They don't always brand themselves very well, but in terms of good places to do business, they're good places to do business. And I think they will get better at branding, and I think over time they will get better lion's share of foreign direct investment.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because we're seeing this sort of alliance, or whatever you want to call it, with those regions between sort of the Middle East, China, Asia and Southeast Asian nations, but also fracturing now in the what seems to appear to be fracturing between the U.S., Europe, even Canada. Any thoughts on sort of that juxtaposition while the rest of the world sort of comes together, sort of that separation, arguably, that we're seeing, particularly between Europe and the U.S.?
So it was interesting because last week, right, was the 50th anniversary of EU-China relationships. And there was a summit between the EU and China in Beijing. Xi Jinping and EU leaders were there. There were very low expectations for the summit. The low expectations were met. Nothing grand happened. There were a lot of questions about this from businesses. And the answer to me was because to China, they don't need Europe as much as they used to. In part because their future lies with the countries that I just mentioned in the previous answer. It's not that they don't want to do business with Europe and they don't want Europe to continue to invest in China, they do, but ultimately they don't need them as much as they used to. So there's a lot happening in Europe that still makes it very competitive, but Europe is also getting harder to govern at the EU level because you used to have many governments in the EU that were sort of in the same spectrum politically.
Right.
Now you're having huge divergences to the left and the right, especially the right. And I think there's going to be more of that over the next couple of years. And that's every country's right, no pun intended, but it does make governance at the EU harder. I think for the US, we're going to have to figure out over the long run, how do we navigate a world that has become less needful of us as we have somewhat withdrawn from it.
So let's go back to China, and I'm interested in the rise of China, whether we think economically, technologically, you already mentioned AI, diplomatically. How is that reshaping the business environment? Maybe spend a little more time on China.
So I think it's doing it in a tremendous way. And for what it's worth, I think a lot of what American businesses consume on a daily basis that is in the American press sometimes underestimates or gets some of the stories on China from a misleading angle. So for instance, the Chinese economy is not as booming as they would like. This leads to bottom line assessments that China is weak, which is not true. Right? I think geopolitically, at the very least, I've never seen China better at executing its strategic plans. China wants a certain number of things that aren't always well understood. They don't want to take over the world. They don't want to be the hegemon. They could have stepped in and solved the crisis between Cambodia and Thailand last week. Chose not to. They could have stepped in between Israel and Iran. Chose not to. Right? That's not currently in their list of things that they want to do. Right?
India, Pakistan.
Yeah, I don't think that Xi Jinping has any desire to sit and get a Nobel Prize. He's got other prizes that in mind. He's trying to do other things, and that's move China to a place where it can operate independently with authority in its neighborhood, which is Asia. And I think they are executing that plan extraordinarily well. A lot of this is about technology. Now, I would say two things about this. One of them is, I think that China is very carefully guarding the true nature of its advanced technologies. Right? Everybody was sort of shocked when DeepSeek came on the scene.
Huge news.
So they chose, of all the aces that they keep very guarded, to lay one down on the table. I think they have a lot of other aces, and they're going to be very careful about showing them. And so that means when companies are trying to truly understand the state of China's technology advancements, it's really hard, because I think they are purposefully obfuscating that for their own purposes. The other thing is, at some point they want technological independence from the United States. That's a long road. They're not there yet.
We've seen a lot of this in the chips space, right?
We've seen a lot of it in the chip space. And part of that comes out of a sense of fear. It is their fear that at some point, the US is just going to decouple completely. And they don't want to be destroyed when that happens. But geopolitically, I think China is making a lot of really good moves. I think it is gaining from the current geopolitical volatility and uncertainty. And I think the more that it sits back and acts carefully, the more that it will be successful geopolitically.
All right, so let's maybe move to the U.S. So how do you see events in the U.S., and we already talked a little bit about tariffs, but impacting the global operating environment?
So look, the U.S. still matters so much to the global operating environment. And I think the U.S. is probably still going to be the number one most dynamic market in the world to come for some time. But I think there are two things, right, that have really made the U.S. so strong, that have underpinned U.S. macroeconomic decision making. Right? One of them is the strength of the dollar, and the other is the dynamism of the U.S. market. And the dollar is still preeminent, but I have more companies than ever before that ask me about it, which doesn't mean it's weak. But I don't like the fact that they're asking over and over and over again. And I'm sure you're getting like the same questions.
Those questions weren't asked 10 years ago.
No, and they're asked all the time now, which tells you a lot. I think the U.S. marketplace is still incredibly dynamic, but you have other policies that come into play here, including federal funding, right? Scientific advancement. How well are certain sectors going to be able to make up for certain cuts that have happened here in town? So I think there's a lot that the U.S. can still do, and U.S. companies certainly lead in most of the sectors that they're in. But I think overall, what U.S. companies are going to have to figure out is, over time, I think more investment is going to shift to those countries and those regions we've talked about. And those are often regions where U.S. companies and U.S. investors don't have a lot of experience. So they're going to have to increase their global acumen on those places and their market acumen and their deals acumen very quickly. And I would start to do that now, because if you don't have that, you're going to start to lose out.
So maybe let me ask a similar question, but instead of the U.S. from a European perspective, and particularly all the political shifts that we've seen in Europe, and how is that impacting the global environment?
So I think it's impacting the global environment because Europe has often been able to play a very stabilizing role. And it still does to a degree. But I mean, it's been a long time. It's been decades since the EU was first founded. And you still have member states that can act on their own, right? France and Germany can still act as France and Germany, but they also act within the EU context as part of the union. As governance at the union becomes harder, the union becomes less of a pacifying tool, right? And just as we have cut aid, Europe has also cut aid, in part because their economies are smaller. They have begun to look inward. They're trying to figure out, with aging populations, how do they get enough economic growth when they are incredibly dependent on places like China. So I think there is a lot of good that could happen with Europe, but I am less confident that there is going to be continent-wide coordination that is going to be there to enable them to get it. And if they don't have that, then you go back to a period of time where it was sort of every member state for itself. And then you're having countries, even powerful countries like France, that have to compete against giants like China and the US, not as part of one of the biggest markets is the EU, but as themselves. Right? The Brits went through this with Brexit. It's a much different thing to compete on your own, when all of a sudden you have to join trade agreements, not as a big partner, but a junior partner. And I think we may see some of that. I don't think the EU is going away. I think the EU is incredibly resilient. But I think there is a lot of challenge for how Europe is going to govern itself. And that is something I think that is very much in their minds.
Yeah, again, another example of tax, and where what you said is really playing itself out. All 27 member states agreed to this global minimum tax system of Pillar 2. And the thought was that, this is going back over 5 years, where there was originally G7 agreement, but then ultimately the EU several years ago adopted a directive which would require unanimous consent. I think many of us, and I think there's probably some prior recordings on the podcast where I was like, there's no way that's going to happen. And it did. All 27 member states. Many have described it more as a political agreement than a tax policy agreement, which is probably a fair characterization. But there's starting to be some ripples now in the pond. And even a few weeks ago, German Chancellor Merz came out and started questioning German support for Pillar 2 publicly. And this was big news. And then less than 24 hours later, his finance minister comes out and walked that comment back. I presume it was because the finance minister reminded the chancellor that part of his coalition agreement with the Democratic Socialists agreed to support Pillar 2. So I try to tell, taxpayers not to overly index, but I think the point to be taken is the point that you made, is that it shows now, how tightly knit is the EU? There's, of course, like in every other country, there's been major changes, and who's leading what countries, major changes, and those the where they sit in the political spectrum.
Agreed.
But I'm very interested to see, particularly with the G7 agreement with Pillar 2, how those geopolitics are going to play out in a tax perspective. And what I tell taxpayers, that creates risk for this agreement, and what is the likelihood of what they put on these bullet points, these 4 principles in the G7 agreement. What does that mean, and how or if they can even become into law? Maybe the second point that I'll make on the EU that has been very fascinating for me, studying this now for years, and now seeing sort of the Trump administration dealing with the EU, and particularly on the trade and tariffs, is that President Trump and his administration can negotiate with the policymakers at the EU. They can come to an agreement, but then the EU has no authority over any of these countries, and then ultimately each country has to agree with these changes. And so it's effectively like 2 layers of bureaucracy, right, that Europe has to deal with to be able to effectuate any changes, whether it's tax, trade, or any other policy.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah, it's very and it was also interesting. I thought that President Trump was very frustrated with the pace of the negotiations with the EU, if you remember, and then ratcheted up the potential tariffs. And as an outside observer, I was just wondering, it's just well, it just takes a long time to get stuff through the EU. I mean, you gotta place at least 27 phone calls, right? To figure out, are we going to be in agreement? What is our position? I'm not suggesting that every country is, but
yes,
it takes time
it does.
for the EU to make decisions. All right, so. Let's talk a little bit about resilience. So one of the other terms that we've used, de-risking and resilience. What does resilience actually mean in the world of this permanent disruption, or what feels like permanent disruption?
So what I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to this question and similar ones has been firefighting. I think it is very difficult to sell having better firefighting capability when there is no fire.
Yeah.
The problem is when there is a fire, you are too busy and too distracted, right, to have the same conversation. So there's never an ideal time. But to me, I think what resilience equates to more than anything else in this geopolitical environment is 2 things. It's ability, and it's avoiding a failure of imagination. And what I mean by failure of imagination gets to a lot of the points that we have talked about already, which is, I think in this environment, anybody and the corporate leadership team that talks about a geopolitical issue and says that'll never happen should not be part of the conversation. Because we are living in an era where that'll never happen happens every day, because so much has come loose in the system for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's going to take decades for those things to be tied down again. And when they get tied down again, they're not going to be in the same place they were before or in the same shape. So I think there is opportunity here. And what I mean by that is, the first thing that I think you need to do is, I think that risk, the way that it's done in many companies, needs to be completely reimagined. I think in many companies it is far too reactive. It's far too much about ticking boxes and not enough about seeing around corners or over the next valley, which is a lot to do for businesses that are busy. But I think in this environment you have to, and I think that means you need to change up the methodologies you use. Like, for instance, I was down with a company yesterday in Florida. This is all we talked about for an hour, was how do you change the way that you use different methodologies to foresee risk, right? And it was a wonderful conversation. They were a really smart group. They're trying to get a strategy that's far more adaptable so that no matter what happens, right, it's going to survive. So I think you have to do that. I think the other thing that you have to do is in that 80-15-5 construct I mentioned, where 80% are sort of standing in place, 15% are thinking about moving, and 5% are moving, you got to figure out where you are. And if you're not in that 5%, you don't have to be, but I think you need to go through some thought exercises about what it would look like. Because at some point, I think companies are going to have to accept that, repeating what I said a couple of minutes ago, this is not temporary change. This is real structural tectonic change. And if that's true, if I'm right about that, what it means is this is probably the worst and the best time to reinvent your business. It's the worst time because you're taking a big risk. It's the best time because your competitors probably aren't doing it. And so if you reinvent yourself or parts of your business while all of this uncertainty is raining down on you.
Yeah, and it's not geopolitical, it's also technology, everything.
Workforce, tax, like everything, right? It's a lot.
Right.
And I'm not saying this is easy, but if you can, you might emerge on the far side of all of this volatility way ahead in terms of your competition. And so I think that is one of the things that resilience means to me is the willingness to even consider that possibility. It's not just about what I think many of us used to mean about resilience, which was almost defensive. I think you need to be almost offensive about resilience and go on the offense and start to think about positioning your company in a very different way.
So what are maybe some of the concrete steps? So I certainly understand kind of the theory and the scenario planning and business reinvention, but what are some concrete steps that companies can take to operate in this, in the world and with all the uncertainty?
So the first one, I'm going to mix up a whole bunch of like animal metaphors.
All right.
Right, that is a hobby horse of mine.
Okay.
Is gray rhinos, right? And gray rhinos is a concept that we didn't create, that many companies know or call by other things. Some people call them high impact, low probability events. So they're called gray rhinos because, like rhinos that are out there wandering around on the savannah, if you're out there with them, right, they usually stay out there on the horizon. You know they're a risk, but they're way over there. But at any given point in time, they can charge at you with enormous unpredictability and speed. And then you need a plan as to what you're going to do with the rhino. Identifying known risks that could either create a massive opportunity or a massive challenge for the business. Thinking about how you identify those, who is responsible for monitoring them, gets you a closer way to being agile in terms of risk. And it also allows you to put these things aside. And what I mean by that is, look, this company yesterday is a great example. If they had to list out all the risks they're dealing with, there's 60, 70, 80,
I'm sure.
Which could happen for any company. When they think about the most pressing risks to their business, the ones that could really disrupt it, those are the ones they're going to identify as gray rhinos. Once they've identified them and how they will monitor them, you put them behind glass and put them away, and you can focus your energy on something else because you've gone through the exercise of doing that. And the other thing that I always find interesting when you have this gray rhino discussion, even amongst any corporate team, right? Even if it's just the local tax guys, is a whole bunch of assumptions get floated to the surface that people have differences on, right? That person believes X, Y, and Z are assumptions, and that person believes exactly the opposite. And Y leads to something valuable for the company that makes it more resilient, that gets to perceptions about risk and opportunity. And if you can do all of this, you can start to identify the opportunities. So for instance, if you have massive opportunities or massive risks that were identified by, if you operate in Europe, one of the gray rhino risks that faces Europe is the possibility that at some point, Russia may decide to attack a NATO member. Okay, would be a bad geopolitical outcome. It would also probably lead to a spike in demand for aerospace and defense, right, and other things. So it's a gray rhino that creates risk, but it could also lead to a whole chain of opportunities if you've thought about them in advance. And that's, I think, where you want to get to. And when I think about those 15%, that's what they're doing. They're not doing anything yet, but they're identifying gray rhinos. And when they choose to have scenario exercises, they're not exercising anything, they're exercising the gray rhinos. So it allows them to have real focus too about the things that worry them and the things that don't.
I love the practical advice. All right, so I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here to end things. We try to avoid predictions generally from a tax perspective, at least that's what my policy people tell me. So we try to avoid sort of the predictions from a tax, but I think this is much larger than tax, right? So looking ahead to 2030, what do you think will define competitive advantage in this geopolitically fractured world?
So I think one of them is going to be the mastery of data, and not just corporate data, right? It's those countries that are going to be able to monetize their national data of their own citizens the most effectively and protect it. And I would say the US is probably behind in that, right? And I think China, the EU are way ahead. I think that's going to matter because that's going to impact how you do the second thing, and that's how you incorporate AI. I think one of the things to think about in terms of AI though, and this gets to a gray rhino risk, is what concerns me about AI is the group of threat actors that I think companies constantly miss in their assessments. And that is foreign intelligence services, which want the IP and the expertise that companies have. They also sometimes want those companies to make mistakes. And as we are ingesting massive amounts of data into AI, foreign intelligence entities have the ability to go in and manipulate that data so that when it comes into the AI system, the AI purposefully, is misfed bad data, and it comes up with a bad judgment. So with honest data, maybe the answer would have been, don't do this deal. But with misleading data, maybe you do the deal because the foreign intelligence entity wants you to make the mistake. So I think they're going to have to think a lot about that.
Yeah, and even with honest data, sometimes you can get odd results. So
I think the other one, and I can't believe I'm going to say this because it's so off-brand for me.
All right.
That I think is honestly going to matter more and more is happiness. And that is the happiness of national populations. You have a lot of populations around the world that are not happy. They are not happy with the way their countries are being governed. They're not happy with their economic point of view or their economic place in the world. I think that is going to matter more and more. And if those people cannot be assuaged, if they can't be given more opportunity, that is going to cause a degree of anger that could really disrupt the system, not just at a local and national level, but globally. And so those countries that have figured out happiness, and when those happiness rankings come out every year, everybody always laughs, right? A, because we're never on the list,
right,
or very high on the list, and B, nobody cares. Don't blow that list off. Look at what's happening there. And why did those countries figure that out? And what does it mean for their productivity? What does it mean for people wanting to go to that country and be a part of that economy? And it's a very hard thing to do. And the individual happiness of its citizens is not really the job of any government. But I think over time, the collective happiness of groups across countries and within countries compared to one another is going to matter more and more. And those that can figure it out, I think they're going to be magnets for growth. And those who can't, they may stagnate.
All right. Well, Craig, we're going to leave it there. I feel like maybe a little bit of a dark way to end things, but we did talk about
positive.
Happiness.
Yeah.
I think it was Denmark's always at the top of that, right?
One of the Scandinavians,
yes.
yes.
I just recently was in Scandinavia, and those people are happy. It's because I love talking about that happiness survey and asking the questions about why, and it is fascinating. So thank you very much. Fantastic conversation. I could go on for hours on this, but I think we have to leave it at that. Thank you very much for coming on, and look forward to having you on again because the goalposts continue to move for multinationals, and we'll come and try to spot what the next gray rhino might be.
Awesome. Always an honor. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. So thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Craig Stronberg, Senior Director of PwC Intelligence. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.